Yeah, Jack Tull speaking. Tonight we're going to do a little study of some chapters of the book of Daniel. And it's quite interesting because you can see the hand of God working not only to preserve the lives of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but God wanted Nebuchadnezzar's heart. And at the end of the story, chapters 1 through 4, God got his heart. And so we start out, before I get into Daniel, I want to turn to Psalm 115, verse 16. And I want you to keep this always in mind. This is a very important thing here. You know, people talk all the time about the sovereignty of God. Yes, God is sovereign all over except on planet Earth. That's right, because of this Psalm 115, verse 16. Psalm 115, verse 16. The Bible says, even the heavens are the Lord's, but the earth has he given to the children of men. So he's given the earth to man, and if man doesn't pray, God will not interfere. So that's why prayer is so very important, so much. And so we see in the book of Daniel, the theme, according to the textbook, is the sovereignty and power of God over human affairs. But that sovereignty depends on man praying. Man has to pray. Then God will act in accordance with his will. All right. Now, the purpose of the book was to give encouragement to the Jewish exiles in Babylon. The good figs of Jeremiah 24. They were taken to Babylon to preserve their lives and to preserve their culture. And so they were there 70 years. From 605 BC, when the first group, including Daniel and his three friends, were taken to Babylon, and they were taken as hostages. And they were there until 536 BC, 70 years if you count both the starting and the ending year, like the Jews do. And so we have the 70 years of the captivity. Now, this is not the 70 years of the desolations of Jerusalem. That is what Daniel understood later in the book of Daniel, in the chapters we will not be covering. But those are, that is Daniel, that's Jeremiah. Let's turn over there a moment. I want to distinguish clearly between these two captivities. Jeremiah 29, verse 10. Jeremiah 29, verse 10, talks about the captivity. That is from 605 to 536. Jeremiah 25, verse 11, talks about the desolations of Jerusalem. 70 years, starting with 589 when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah for the third time. And it lasted until 520 BC in the reign of Darius the Persian. So those two aren't the same. Anyway, let's go onward. We can realize that chapter 1 of Daniel deals with Daniel and his three friends consecrating themselves to do God's will. So they wouldn't eat the king's sweetmeats, and they decided that even though they were favored in the court, they were going to eat vegetables and stay healthy and strong instead of getting fat and lazy. And so, obviously, they continued their prayer regimen that they used to have in Israel. And so, chapter 1 is basically talking about Daniel and his three friends consecrating themselves to do God's will as captives. Now, folks, you have to understand, these aren't just captives taken in chains. These four men were humiliated. They were made eunuchs. They could never have children at all in life. And so they were humiliated, but then they had to learn the Babylonian language, and that took 3 years. And finally, once they learned the language, Nebuchadnezzar queried them and found them 10 times wiser and stronger than all the other captives that he had, and that his wise men, and astrologers. Because God had given them the spirit of wisdom and revelation. And God had given Daniel knowledge of dreams and interpretation. So it was really, really good for them during this period of captivity. Now let's go over to chapter 2. You know, in 30 minutes, I'm not going to go into details, chapters 1 through 5. But chapter 2, you can say, talks about the great image and the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had and forgot. And so when he tried to remember it, he couldn't. So he called for all the astrologers and magi, the court of Babylon, to try and tell him his dream and then interpret it. And they all said, "O king, this is impossible. You're asking an impossible job of us men, mortal men." And it's true, he was. And so the king was very angry, and he said, "Well, obviously you are not wise men at all. You don't know this dream, and you can't tell me the interpretation. Therefore, you shall die." And so he gave Arioch, the captain of his guard, command to kill all the wise men of Babylon. Well, when Arioch came over to Daniel, Daniel said, "Why is this command so hasty from the king?" And he said, "Give me 1 day and then come back, and God will help us." And so Arioch gave him 1 day, and the next day came back, and actually God met Daniel that night and gave him not only the dream, which was really supernatural, but gave him the interpretation of it too. And so when the guard came back to Daniel the next day, Daniel said, "Don't kill any more wise men. I've got the dream and the interpretation. Take me to the king." So he did. Brought him to the king, and the king was skeptical at this time. The king was very skeptical. Now remember, this king was over a large empire which reached from Egypt through modern-day Iraq. And he was not used to being contradicted or put off, and so he was very angry. So when he came, when Daniel appeared, he said, "Can you tell me the dream?" And he was skeptical. And Daniel said, "Mortal man cannot do it, but there's a God in heaven who reveals secrets unto men." And he said, "This is your dream." And so he told him the dream of the image. He said, "You were wondering as you went to sleep what was going to happen in the future." So he said, "This is what's going to happen. You saw in that dream an image, a huge one, and its head was of gold, and its chest and its arms were of silver, and its thighs and stomach were of brass, and its legs were of iron, and its feet were of both iron and clay." And he said, "This is the interpretation." He said, "You are that great king, that head of gold, O king. Your empire is a wonderful empire, very costly, and very fine and delicate." He said, "After you is going to come another empire, not quite as fine as yours, but," he said, "it'll be stronger, and it's made out of silver." And he said, "It will also conquer the whole known world. And after that will arise another kingdom, which will be still stronger. It'll be made of brass." And he said, that is what the brass band around the loins and the stomach stands for. And he said, finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, and that is signified by the legs. And he said that kingdom will eventually end in feet of clay and iron, partly clay. And of course, we know that that fourth kingdom is the Roman Empire. So the first kingdom then was Babylon. Number 2 was Persia. Number 3 was Greece under Alexander the Great. Number 4 is Rome. And Rome was a mighty kingdom. And Rome did divide into 2 parts, Rome and Byzantium or Constantinople. So there was the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western, corresponding to the 2 legs of iron. And then, of course, the extremities, the feet, were partly iron and partly clay, meaning partly strong, that's the iron, partly broken, that's the democracies. Right, and so he said that is going to come in the end days. And then he said, then that you saw, and a stone was cut out of a mountain without hands, and it rolled against the image and knocked it down and broke everything to pieces. And he said the wind carried it all away. And we know who that stone is. That's Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And then he said the stone grew to be a mighty mountain. And the king was just really entranced by this because it was so accurate. And Daniel told it without any hesitation because he had seen the dream and God had told him the interpretation. And Daniel said, the dream is certain and the interpretation of it is sure. And the king immediately, with his first encounter with the God of Daniel, remember that, his first encounter with the God of Daniel, fell to his knees and worshiped Daniel. I'm sure Daniel said, don't worship me, worship the God of heaven who gave me that dream. And so he promoted Daniel, put him over everything in Babylon and in his kingdom under Nebuchadnezzar. And so it was a tremendous promotion. Daniel then spoke to the king and said, O king, this dream was not revealed to me for my sake, but for the sakes of those who will also make known the dream to the king. And that was his 3 friends, because they had a part in that dream. And you can imagine Daniel gave them a chance to talk as well. And so the king promoted them too. And so in the province of Babylon. Chapter 3 talks about the image that the king sets up. He set up a huge image of gold, and he forced all the people in the plain of Babylon, which is Shinar, that area, he forced them all to worship the image, and he had all kinds of musical instruments there. And he said, when you hear the instruments play, everyone must fall down and worship the image which I have made. The image was pure gold. Now, I don't know if it was hollow or not, or solid, but a 90-foot tall image, 9 feet wide, is a lot of gold. And so when the music sounded, everybody fell down and worshiped except Daniel's 3 friends. Now you might add, where's Daniel in all this? Daniel was so valuable to the king that the king sent him as ambassador to Persia, to Elam. And so he was over there out of the country when this happened. So instead, his 3 friends refused to bow. They didn't worship the image, and they were tattled on. And because of the people who were jealous, they were so jealous. And so they said, O king, these 3 Jews whom you've promoted don't worship your gods, and they do not honor you, O king. The king was furious because he had warned that if anyone would not worship the image, he would throw them in the middle of a burning fiery furnace. So the king said, bring those 3 men to me. So they did. When the 3 men came in, the king said to them, now this is wise of the king, Nebuchadnezzar. He wanted to make sure of it. He didn't want a rumor because he knew that these guys were promoted and that the ones who accused him were jealous. So he said, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you will not worship the image which I have set up? Now, let me explain. The image here, the answer of the three men is really amazing. And it's been misinterpreted so many times. So the king conversed with them. Pardon me. Let me find it a minute here. It's in chapter 3. Now he says, if you be ready, in other words, I'm going to give you a second chance. If you be ready at the sound of the music and all the instruments which I have set up, if you be ready, when they start playing and you fall down and worship the image, well, I'll forgive you your first sin where you did not fall down. But if you don't, you'll be thrown in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Now, the answer of the three boys, the men, was this. If it be so, now you got to ask yourself, if what be so? If they get thrown into the furnace, if that be so, they said, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Wow, that was like a slap of the face. If it be not so, now folks, here's the problem. They weren't talking about not being delivered. They were talking about not being thrown into the furnace, because the king gave them that option. He said, if you worship the image, I won't throw you in, even though you sinned against me. So, if it be not so, if we don't get thrown into the fiery furnace, we still aren't going to worship your God, O king. And so, that's what made the king so furious. He was absolutely livid with rage. That's why he commanded them to heat the furnace 7 times hotter. He said, heat that baby up. I want to throw these guys in. And he took the mightiest men of his army, the mightiest men, strongest and boldest, and they bound the 3 men in their clothing and tried to throw them into the fire. Well, they finally threw them in, but those men who carried them died from the heat because they got too close. Now, immediately, even before the 3 men were thrown in, you could see God's hand in theirs because the heat had no effect on the 3 men. But on their captors, the ones who threw them in, the heat killed them. And so the king looked into the furnace and he saw those 3 men alive, walking around, unbound, and he saw a 4th man in there. And he said, didn't we throw 3 guys into the fire? Who's this 4th man? And so he called to the 3 men and said, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. And when they came out, the king was shocked because not only were they not burned or blistered, but the heat had absolutely no impact on them, and their clothing was not smoky, and the smell of the fire didn't attach itself to them in any way. The king was absolutely shocked. This is his second encounter with the God of Daniel, the second one. And so, after the first one, when only the true God could reveal that dream, he realized Daniel's God was the true God, but he did not worship him. He just honored him temporarily. But now they come forth from the furnace, and he says, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel. Now, Jesus wasn't there with them in the furnace. No. Jesus sent his angel. It's an angel that has power over fire. And that angel is described, or mentioned, rather, in Revelation 14, verse 18. Revelation 14, verse 18. There's an angel that has power over fire. And so that angel was told, you go into that furnace with those 3 men and keep them from feeling any effect of that fire. So he said he sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and has changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that every people, nation, and language who speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their house shall be made a dung heap, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. In other words, all my gods, and Nebuchadnezzar worshiped Marduk, Bel, Marduk, and other Babylonian gods. He said, no other God can save after this sort. He was right. So you can see that pride is coming down step by step. Then, chapter 4, now we have the king dreaming again. This dream he remembered. No one could interpret the dream except Daniel, who was called. And the king said that he dreamed that there was a large tree, and all the birds of the heaven had refuge in it. The beasts of the forest took refuge underneath it. Great big tree. And he said there was a watcher and a holy one who came down from heaven and said, cut down the tree and put a band around the stump for 7 times. That means 7 years. Until the king shall know that the God reigns in the heavens, and that he gives the kingdom to whomever he will. And so Daniel gave forth that interpretation. He said, he talked about the watchers and holy ones. And by the way, just a small aside here, there are watchers in the Bible over Jerusalem. Look at Ezekiel chapter 9. That's right. They're mentioned there. And I think it's just my thought that there are watchers over every city in America, in every town, not only in America, worldwide. And they watch and they report to God. Now, why does God need those reporters? Because he knows all things. A quick answer is this: God needs witnesses so that when he judges, his judgment will be counted righteous and not bad judgment. God is a righteous and merciful judge, but he has to have witnesses of the evil, the sins of the world, so the watchers report. Okay, going forward, Daniel then told the king that that tree was you, O king. You. And the tree shall be cut down. He said, in essence, you will go insane for 7 years, and you'll eat grass of the field like an ox, and your mind will not be normal. It'll be abnormal until you realize that God, most holy, rules in the heavens and gives the kingdom to whosoever he will. And then, but he said, your throne and your glory will be restored to you, O king, after those 7 years. Well, it's very important to note that that prophecy didn't happen right away. A year later, 1 year later, Nebuchadnezzar was at his palace looking over the city of Babylon and bragging, isn't this great Babylon which I have built for my honor and my glory and my majesty? And then the words came from the watcher, let the tree be cut down. And immediately he lost his mind. And they threw him out of the palace. He had to go and eat grass like an ox. And the whole thing took place exactly as the interpretation of the dream. At the end of that time, it's very interesting to notice that he realized finally that God rules in the heavens, not Nebuchadnezzar. God rules, and God gives the kingdom to whomever he will. It's not Nebuchadnezzar by his might and his power got the kingdom. No, God gave it to him. And so he said At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and my brightness returned to me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Now, look at this last verse of chapter 4. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways justice, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. And so he realized finally that he had walked in pride. After the third encounter with the God of Daniel, he realized it. God revealed to him his pride. And I believe with all my heart that he became a worshiper of the true God. And I believe we're going to be acquainted with him in heaven. It's amazing. Now let's go to chapter 5, his grandson. His grandson through his daughter, who married a man called Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king's son-in-law, and his daughter had a son called Belshazzar. Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar were made joint rulers of Babylon when the king died. Joint rulers. So, and Nebuchadnezzar had a curious mind, and so he didn't stay in the city very much. He went out and inspected other nations. And at the time that chapter 5 takes place, he was over in Edom. He was out of the area of Babylon. Chapter 5 takes place, and Belshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, you can just imagine that the king Nebuchadnezzar, while still alive, had told his grandson all these stories. He told him about the dream that he'd forgotten and how Daniel revealed that. He told him about the image and the fiery furnace, and no God can save like that. And his grandson was amazed, I'm sure. But now, and of course, when the king finally, his pride was broken, his grandson saw that as well. Saw that. And that his grandfather had gone insane for 7 years. And ended up worshiping the God of Daniel. But his grandson mocked the God of Daniel. So he said, we're going to hold a feast and here in the palace, and we're going to take the vessels of the temple that my grandfather took from Jerusalem, and we're going to put wine in them, and we're going to have a drunken brawl. We're going to have a good feast. Y'all come. And so he just mocked the vessels which were sacred and which had been used to worship in the temple. The cups, the saucers, the plates and all that stuff, the bowls, to hold incense and sweet-smelling things to worship God, the God of heaven, the God of the Jews. And he defiled them by pouring in wine, and they got drunk, and all of a sudden the fingers of a man's hand appeared on the wall and wrote a message on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And it means numbered, weighed, and divided. That's what those 4 words mean. Nobody could read the writing except Daniel, again. But the Queen Mother remembered, Daniel the prophet, when Nebuchadnezzar was still alive, he was a great interpreter of dreams. So they called in Daniel. And Daniel said, the dream be to those that hate you. But he said, this is the interpretation of it. He said, even though your grandfather told you all these stories about himself and the pride that he had, and you saw the punishment that he suffered, yet you didn't take account of this, but you raised up in pride and you mocked against the God of heaven. And therefore the fingers of the hand were sent from God. And this is what it means. You are numbered. Your kingdom is numbered. You've been weighed in the balances, in the scales, and been found wanting. You're a lightweight. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Well, the king, that was a hard prophecy to deliver, but it was true. Daniel always spoke the truth. And the king had promised that the person who could interpret that writing would be clothed in scarlet and be given a gold chain around his neck and will be proclaimed the third ruler in the kingdom. Now that is right after his father and himself. So Daniel was promoted immediately to the third ruler in the kingdom. However, that same night, Belshazzar was killed because Cyrus the Persian and his army had built a diversionary canal to the Euphrates River. And that night they broke the dam holding the diversion apart from the river, the Euphrates. And the Euphrates level dropped considerably. And the Babylonians had a great iron gate which went down a little bit below the level of the water. But they never dreamed that the water would dry up. And so when the water level fell considerably, Cyrus and his troops were able to walk on the bottom of the riverbed, and with the water up to their necks, they were able to go into the city unhindered, because the soldiers were drunk. They were having a feast, remember? And so this pride cost Belshazzar the kingdom and his life. So even though he had seen his grandfather be abased step by step, 3 times he encountered the God of Daniel, and each time he was abased more and more, he didn't take it to heart. He didn't say, well, that's for me. No. He said, I'm going to mock that God of Daniel. He has no power. We're going to drink out of the vessels in his temple. That very night, judgment was passed upon him quickly. You might ask, why did God have mercy on Nebuchadnezzar and not on Belshazzar? I believe the answer is that Nebuchadnezzar didn't know the God of Daniel, had never heard of him. And he had just conquered every army that he faced, he conquered. So it was natural for him to think, hey, I'm the greatest. I'm the conqueror of the world. And he needed that humbling in 3 parts. But his grandson saw all that. And he knew exactly the penalty that his grandfather had paid. And he knew about the God of heaven. Why didn't he take other vessels to drink out of and not the temple vessels? Because he was going to mock the God of heaven. So that was a poke in the eye of God. But God had the last poke because he died that very night. Well, I trust that you have learned, in fact I have when I studied all this, be very careful of pride. Don't let it creep in. Don't let people praise you and call you great and a wonderful man of God or woman of God. Don't let that go to your head. Instead, it's God who does all this stuff. It's the Lord who humbles mankind. And the Lord resists the proud, it says in James 4, verse 8, but gives grace to the humble. What would you rather have? Resistance or grace? I know what I'd rather have. Let's humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God and let him exalt us in due time. Amen? Hallelujah.
Amen.
God bless you this week.
Amen.
Hallelujah.
Amen.
God bless you all.
Amen.
In Jesus' name,
God help us.
amen.
Amen.
Hallelujah.